Well, aside from Plato, um, Landsberg discusses the philosophies of death of other ancient philosophies besides Plato and Platonism. He has a lot of interesting things to say about Stoicism, and Stoicism is a very interesting philosophy in general. Probably not as studied as it once was, but incredibly influential philosophy, mostly associated with Roman writers and formed a huge part of education, classical education, old style education at some point, but it's really fallen out of attention, which is kind of too bad, I think. But in any case, I'm going to ignore what his discussion of the Stoics because it's more relevant to us. I think is his brief discussion of Epicurus, and I think, frankly, Epicurus's views of death are probably more important in general than Stoicism. But in any case, his discussion of Epicurus begins we're at the bottom of page 215, just after his discussion of Plato, and we couldn't find, as we know, two more different philosophies of death than Epicurus and Plato. But Landsberg says this: Epicurus is the originator, right here, of a doctrine which has been repeated and discussed at infinite length. It might be called the sophism of the inexistence of death. And that is a very good thing to keep in mind. That Landsberg, let's see if I can, I'm just going to open up a blank page. So, yes, this notion of the sophism of the inexistence of death. That's how Landsberg is characterizing Epicurus's idea of death. And he more or less paraphrases or quotes the famous this is a paraphrase, obviously. It's not quite what our translation said, but it's close, I think. Um, this, I think, is a fair characterization. Why would Landsberg characterize this as a sophism? Well, what is a sophism? A sophism is, well, that's a, first of all, it's a criticism, right? Um, uh, he himself explains what he means by sophism further down on page 216, right about here. He says, but the conclusion remains a sophism and is only a formula of escape. It endeavors to disprove verbally something from which man cannot escape in reality. So the use of words, the use of reason in a deceptive way to mischaracterize the reality of things, the truth of things, that would be a sophism. To use words in a way that probably, usually deliberately, but maybe not even deliberately, because certainly Epicurus was not deliberately trying to confuse us about death, but to use words and reason and language to obfuscate rather than to clarify is, I think, fair characterization of what a sophism is. So it's really a dismissal, I would say, a really strong dismissal of Epicurus. That this argument, which is a crucial argument, as we know in Epicurus, is simply a use of language, a misleading use of language, which on the surface of it's not. I mean, it's not. I mean, obviously a sophism at all. And Epicurus did not mean to deceive us or confuse us. I think he sincerely meant to clarify things, to shed light on the situation. So why would Landsberg characterize this as a sophism? Well, he's focusing on the conclusion, and his characterization of it down here in the middle, when he says it's a form of escape because it endeavors to disprove verbally something from which man cannot escape in reality, the complete upheaval of human existence, not through fear of any disagreeable sensation which might be experienced after death, but by an anguish at the thought of death itself and its power over the person. So there we have it. It's the conclusion. It's not so much saying that this is ridiculous. Of course, Landberg doesn't think this is the truth about death, but no one could say that it's absurd or that it's not a viable or plausible way of starting a philosophy of death. It's this that he has problems with. That is, he doesn't think that this follows from this. It's a fallacy. He could have used that maybe rather than sophism. It's a fallacy, and that means that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. If the premise is when we are, death is not; when death is not, we are not. The conclusion is therefore we should not fear it, since it is nothing to us. So, what Landsberg is saying is that doesn't follow, and he says it's just a way of trying to escape from the inescapable, and the inescapable is uh, it is nothing itself that we fear. The Epicurus's conclusion does not follow because it assumes that the only thing we have to fear is pain and suffering. And Landsberg's point is that what we really fear and what causes anguish with regard to death is not any pain and suffering that may come before or after, but rather the annihilation of the self itself, the facing our own nothingness. And I would say that despite his very explicit attempt to distinguish himself from Heidegger, this is what makes Landsberg an existentialist, because he's saying the exact same thing that Jaspers said in the Gray Essay, and that is that it's the nothingness itself that we fear. It's the horror and dread of that makes death an awful thing, that makes death a threat and a menace. It's not the pain associated with it. So I think it's clear that Landsberg is an existentialist. He's just that he's a Christian one. And he's not the first Christian existentialist, because it could be that Kierkegaard in the 19th century was a Christian existentialist, but certainly an existentialist in some respects. In other respects, a kind of a traditional Catholic thinker. So a very interesting thinker, I would say, as a result of that. But I would say a very valuable little critique of Epicurus. And it doesn't mean that Landsberg is right and Epicurus is wrong. I think that would be kind of, that's not obvious at all, but it is helpful to us, because I'm sure that many of us are Epicureans, that we started this class, read Epicurus, were convinced by the letter to Monoicus, and that essentially all the criticisms from Hegel and Bruckner and Fischer and all of the the alternatives that are given by Plato, that probably a lot of us in this class remain committed Epicureans, and I think that's right in the sense that there should be some people, and there should be a mix of people who are convinced by different philosophies. It would be a bad sign if everyone emerged as an Epicurean, but it would also be a bad sign in the class if everyone emerged as a Platonist, um, or a Landsbergian, or an existentialist, So, which is to say, it's not clear that Landsberg is right in his dismissal of Epicurus, but it's also not clear that he's wrong.